To illustrate multi-level MRP, we're going to modify the Arborcrest Ale Studios company and assume that they've bought a roaster to roast their malts. A number of roasted malts are used in the recipe, and roasted malts are what give beer its character and flavor. In the previous examples, Arborcrest has purchased these. Now we're going to assume that they purchased a malter. Now we're going to assume that they purchased a roaster, and what they're going to do is take base malts and roast them, basically toast them and caramelize the starches and the sugars. Going to purchase a roaster to roast the malts, give them a dark caramelized flavor and color, and do that to reduce costs and add flexibility rather than purchasing the roasted malt. This means there's another production process that needs to be managed. There are 6 malts that are roasted that are used in the Arborcrest Ale recipes. 4 of these are going to be produced using the base 2-row malt, and 2 of these will be produced by roasting pale malt. This means that when we calculate the quantities of roasted malt, we need to transfer that calculation into additional requirements for the base malt. In the planning process, demand is driven by independent requirements, which are the result of the sales and operations planning process. This is for make to stock. This is for the make to stock environment, or customer orders if we're talking about a make to order environment. The independent requirements or customer orders define the finish date for the final product, in this case finished beer. Using backward scheduling, this will determine the start date for the production order, and this is used to determine a dependent requirement for specialty malts. Specialty malts are something we produce internally. They have a certain lead time required. This creates a start date for the specialty malt for the roasting process. The start date creates a dependent requirement that will determine when base malts are needed. Base malts are purchased, so again subtracting the lead time will determine the start date for the purchase order for base malts. Remember that finished beer also uses the majority of base malts, so not only will demand come to the base malt, through the specialty malt and the roasting process, but the start date for finished beer will also create demand for the base malt directly. Both of those demand sources need to be considered. We look at the bill of material. There's 2-row malt that's going to be used directly into Edgar Ale. Also, we're going to look at Crystal 60L malt, a specialty malt that we're going to roast from the 2-row malt. So again, there's a direct usage of 2-row malt in Edgar Ale, but also a usage of 2-row malt in the specialty grains, and we'll focus in this example on the Crystal 60L malt. Here's our beginning example. We have stock for Edgar Ale of 3,264 and an independent requirement for 15,000 cases on the 29th. That's far enough into the future that the lead time is sufficient. Again, MRP doesn't consider capacity, so this may or may not be feasible. But for this example, it will illustrate the MRP calculations. After running MRP, what will result, in this case we're using a lot size of EX of 1240, meaning we're going to create a single order of whatever's required, but there's a rounding parameter of 1240, so we'll do it in multiples of 1240, which is one fermenter batch. We're using EX in this case because it keeps the account. We're using EX in this case to keep the example simple. If we were to do this example with FX, which would be used in practice, there'd be a lot of details and a lot of orders to follow through. So we want to create a single order for the finished product to trace it through the specialty grain and to the base malt. After running MRP, we get a planned order. After running MRP, we get a planned order for 1,000. After running MRP, we get a planned order for 12,400 cases of beer. The finish date is the 29th, the date that it's required. The date of the independent requirement. This means the production order start date is the 14th, counting back 15 days for the lead time. This planned order will create a dependent requirement for the Crystal 60L. If we look at the Crystal 60L, we can see the dependent requirement showing up on the 14th on the date that the production order for the Edgar Ale should start. So the production of finished beer creates the dependent requirement that defines when specialty malt needs to be finished and also determines the quantity required from the bill of material. Again, our bill of material says that 1,240 cases of Edgar Ale require 550 pounds of crystal malt. So the 1,240 cases will then require 5,500 pounds of crystal ale malt, which we will have to roast. Returning to the stock requirements list for Edgar Ale, we ask the question, what does the stock requirements list look like for 2-row malt? The 2-row malt has a dependent requirement directly from the Edgar Ale because 5,555 pounds of 2-row malt, the base malt, are required for each 1,240 cases produced. So the dependent requirement is for 55,550 pounds of 2-row malt. This is demand directly from the production of Edgar Ale, but we also have to add in the demand for 2-row malt that's created by the specialty malt that we are going to roast. If we return to the Crystal 60L malt, we have a dependent requirement and a negative inventory level. We need to run MRP for this particular material to see what production orders. We need to run MRP for this material to create a production order for the roaster to roast the crystal malt. This will also create a dependent demand. This will also create a dependent demand for 2-row malt. After we run MRP, we get a planned order to be completed by the 14th when we need to start the roasting process. This creates a requirement date, a start date of the 9th of January for the 2-row malt to be available. If we go back to the stock requirements for 2-row malt, we'll see 2 dependent demands. The larger one on the 14th is when the actual brewing of the Edgar Ale will start. The other dependent demand is on the 9th. It's earlier. This is the 2-row malt that's needed for roasting to create the Crystal 60L malt. When we run MRP, we will now create purchase requisitions for 2-row malt. You will see that we have enough 2-row malt on hand to take care of the dependent requirement for the roaster, but we will get a purchase requisition for 28,000 pounds of 2-row malt that's going to be the base malt for the Edgar Ale. The start date for this purchase requisition is January 7th, as the lead time for 2-row malt is 7 days. Summarizing, we can see that the MRP process starts to get complicated for multi-level items. We need to figure out when we need finished beer. This is going to determine the start date for finished beer production, which creates dependent demands for specialty malt and base malt. The specialty malt also requires base malt, so we have to consider specialty malt production before we determine So we have to consider specialty malt production before we know the total requirements for base malt. Looking at this, it becomes apparent that the order of calculations Looking at this, it becomes apparent that the order in which MRP calculations are performed is critical to make sure that we have all of the dependent demands for a product in place before we run MRP on that product. In MRP, this is managed using what's called the low-level code. Looking at the bill of materials, we realize that first we need to figure out what finished products we're going to produce. Those are given low-level code 0, which means they are the first materials that are calculated in the MRP process. The 3 ales, the low-level code is 0 for all of these, and it means that they can be, and it means the low-level code is 0 for all 3 products, which means that the MRP planning process can do any of these products in any order, but these must be done before the next materials. Next, many of the ingredients that go into the beer are given low-level code 1. These products, the MRP calculations for these materials can be done as soon as once we've calculated the requirements for the finished products. However, the 2-row malt and the pale malt have a low-level code of 2. That's because they are used in the production of roasted malts. So the roasted malts need to be calculated. So the MRP calculations need to be completed for the roasted malts before we'll know the total requirements for 2-row malt and pale malt. The major requirements come directly from the beer, as these are base malts for the final product. But demand will also come from the roasting process as we convert those base malts into specialty malts. Calculating the low-level code is a rather tedious and somewhat complex process. Fortunately, the MRP process takes care of that. As bill of materials are created, the low-level codes are calculated or recalculated so that the proper sequence of MRP planning is maintained. Remember that 2-row barley is used in all 3 products. Also, specialty malts that are based on 2-row malting. Also, specialty malts that are based on 2-row barley are used in all 3 products. If we look at Alley Cat Ale and have an independent requirement for 12,000 cases on the 17th, using EX of 1240, exact lot size rounded to multiples of 1240, when we calculate MRP, we get a planned order to be completed on the 17th with a start date of January 2nd. When we look at the 2-row malt, we now see a dependent requirement on the 2nd. We see a new dependent requirement coming from the Alley Cat Ale on January 2nd, which brings our inventory much lower, so that the dependent requirement for 3,100 pounds, which comes from the production of Crystal 60L, now creates a negative inventory level. After running MRP, we now get 2 purchase requisitions, one on the 9th One purchase requisition for 3,000 pounds is on the 9th, and another purchase requisition for 56,000 is on the 14th. Since there's only 5 days separating these 2 purchase requisitions, and one is quite small while the second is quite large, a material planner would probably look at this quantity and create a single purchase requisition and create a single purchase order for 59,000 or maybe 60,000 or another rounded quantity to arrive on the 9th to create one shipment rather than two. This is one of the reasons that there are jobs for material planners.